as a national policy due to the impact that it generates towards the inside of the country, families, and their economies. The right to education of elderly individuals, according to CEPAL, needs to be tackled from two different points of view that complement each other. The rights of elderly individuals to enjoy educational programs, to be able to place their knowledge at the disposal of the youth and younger generation in terms of education. 60% of elderly individuals are illiterate. And in this aspect, women are the ones that have the greatest percentage of illiteracy by being 73.6% compared to male, who are almost 46%, and this is the data from the National Statistics Office of 2016. If the Mexican state truly continues to have a literacy program for elderly individuals, we do not have initiatives that will exhort the development of individuals at this stage by making use of their knowledges and experiences for the betterment of society. Education programs need to adapt to the needs and requirements of elderly individuals. Lower levels of education that are linked to this situation are also seen in the lack of education for youth, female, and the need of adding them and having them involved as a qualified workforce. We also see that females then need to give a priority to income, leaving on the side the cultural aspects without participating in cultural knowledge, such as museum visits, paint classes. They cannot go to cultural events due to the high cost and difficult access of the areas where they take place. There are no programs that can promote cultural knowledge that elderly individuals can have, such as poetry, literature, culture. And in the case of elderly individuals in rural areas, we see that there is no national policy that will promote the strengthening of nations, cultures, people, where elderly individuals can transfer this knowledge to newer generation. Regarding the topic of indigenous communities, we see that they have multiple scourges that have an impact on them regarding their society and community. And then, of course, this is not improved for the lack of social inclusion programs that can reach individuals in urban areas rather than individuals in rural or native areas. And this also is affected by geography, which makes this more difficult due to the region. And of course, this shows a complication when we talk about social programs. Public policy and social programs need to have a specific approach for elderly indigenous individuals. For elderly women, because they live longer, the aging process is a considerably female process. This is why the projection of the total of elderly individuals who are 60 years or older by 2030, it's going to be 11,164,866 who will be female, and this will represent 54.8%. However, we do need to take into account that this apparent advantage in terms of livelihood then becomes a disadvantage because of the deficiencies that they have when they reach elderly ages that affect their quality of life due to the fact that these conditions have been adverse for women now in an elderly age. Housing and nutrition. Housing for an elderly individual needs to be a worthy place that will provide protection and respond to their physical needs. The reality in Mexico is far from this, especially for those individuals who are elderly and on social dependent, to whom the Mexican state does not ensure right to housing because we do not have sufficient public worthy housing projects that will give them a place to live. The comprehensive development system for families, DIF, has provided social assistance programs and has two dental centers and housing centers with a capability from 200 to 300 individuals, which is a minimum capability in terms of demand. For this topic, the federal government then aids civil society in asking them and their institutions to see if they can receive them. The low offer of public establishment has been shown in the census for social housing that has taken place, where within a universe of 4,700 areas in Mexico, 9.7 are publicly owned institutions, 69.3 civil association, 9.8 are institutions of private nature. Another case are older individuals in social abandon that due to some reason are in public hospitals where once discharged they don't have a place to go because their state does not allow them to leave the hospital on their own accord, thus staying in hospitals exposed to carry out and to be infected by any other illnesses. In 2017 in Mexico, in Morelos, Texas, Huachapa, and Chiapas, we see that these conditions that took place in 2017 left several individuals without houses because of the natural disasters that have occurred and no warranty of temporary housing that will give them a worthy housing situation. In the topic of access to nutrition, if we have seen that we've implemented on behalf of some of the governments some contributive programs and community nutrition programs that will ensure access to nutrition on behalf of elderly individuals, especially of those in poverty situations, we still do not have nationally implemented programs that can cover not only the need for food, but also the nutritional need to be able to ensure a broader coverage of this right. We require the Mexican state to ensure regulations and nutrition for all so that we can prevent the waste of hundreds of thousands of tons of food that can still be consumed. You will be able to find more data, more information pertaining to documents that we have shared with you this morning. In terms of access to justice for elderly individuals, I do want to point out that the Mexican government does not have full statistics for this. In the information that we have covered, we are able to notice that for this sector of the population, all of the information is unknown by local and federal authorities, therefore they are not applied. A broad way of looking at access to justice is by thinking of public access to human rights, because the complaints that are seen in these areas look at the violations of human rights that are suffered by elderly individuals. Through the request of information, we have obtained information of individuals who are elderly than 60 who, between January of 2013 and June of 2017, have gone to the non-jurisdictional program, seeing that of 10,844 open claim files, only 133 recommendations have been issued within the time frame of these 4 years. Looking at the recommendations that have been issued by the open house and state commissions, we see that this is less than 1%. If this takes place in the non-jurisdictional area, imagine what happens in the procurement offices, in the prosecution offices of the country. Elderly individuals seek justice when they report crimes. And of the reported crimes, we were able to see that there are 11 elements that this segment of the population reports: abandonment of individuals, seizing of houses, crimes, fraud, homicide, bodily injury, deprivation of freedom, theft. And we accounted in this 4-year period 126,612 files or research folders that have been denounced by elderly individuals in the mentioned felonies. We are talking about the federal state. So we do not know the state of this research or this investigation, but this is an obstacle to access justice. I can even say that several individuals, due to their elderly years, don't even make it to know what their case ended up yielding. In this case of Mexico, we can also say that there are local efforts. For example, on behalf of the Chihuahua government, we have also requested to modify the law to help with the American Convention of Elderly Individuals. And I also declare that with the Public Prosecutor's Office in Oaxaca and the Public Defenders, we want to request the federal government to issue a statement requiring from the executive branch the implementation. And the Human Rights Commission is going to work with public entity would also like to issue a statement on behalf of the elderly individuals and human rights in order to implement first article of the Constitution, so that this way we can see a signing with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. This is all part of what the present organizations and the local government of Chihuahua and the Defender's Office of Oaxaca and National Commission have been working on jointly. Despite the efforts that have taken place on behalf of the civil society, the Commission is far from being a reality in our country because we do not have the economic resources that are required for the implementation. This argument was presented by the former Secretary of Housing, Mr. Amir, denying the Mexican state to become a member of the Commission, who, by the way, is also a candidate to presidency on behalf of the Revolutionary National Party. I asked the Mexican government, though, is this argument still standing then? Based on what has been aforementioned, we ask the Commission of Human Rights to help the Mexican state to carry out the Convention of Elderly Rights as soon as possible for the following reason. One, it will set a precedent for promotion and public awareness and education of the rights of elderly individuals, as well as pushes away from the existentialist approach that continues to affect the different entities that participate. Number two, it will update national legislation because as it is now, it is not enough to protect the rights of elderly individuals. Number three, it will open up a great opportunity for rights assessment and segregation and spreading out to improve the livelihood of elderly individuals in a way that allows us to establish adequate public policy. Four, because of the quick growth of elderly population, this will help the empowerment of the sector by having an impact in their well-being and the reduction of health-related costs. And finally, we want to urge this honorable hearing to take the necessary steps so that our country is visited by the Rapporteur for Human and Cultural Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I invite the state, just 2 seconds. I insist on water being brought to the tables of all parties. Bring the jugs. We have a right to water. And those who are talking have an extraordinary right to water. So please, waiters, agua. Ahora.
Gracias.
I now invite the states to come. I know Soledad agrees with me. We now invite the states to commence their presentation.
Good morning, Madam President. You have the full support of the delegation of Mexico for the right to water. Distinguida comisionada,
distinguished commissioners, Mr. Commissioner, distinguished representatives of the civil society, ladies and gentlemen. For the Mexican government, it is the highest of honors to participate in the present period of sessions of this commission. We thank especially the hospitality of the Dominican Republic government, and we referring our commitment with human rights of all people, with the cooperation and openness and international scrutiny, And of course, with the important mandate of this high Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Mexico participates in this period of sessions knowing that we face challenges in several areas, but convinced also to have the capacity, the means, and moreover the will to attend them in the best way possible, especially in what relates topics such as the protection of human rights of elderly people. It is with that spirit that the delegation of the Mexican state that, as you can observe, is of the highest of levels, will participate on the hearings that will take place during this extraordinary period of sessions. On what pertains to the thematic of this hearing, we will highlight aspects that are relevant that will allow us to illustrate the comprehensive approach that the Mexican state gives to the rights of elderly people, just like actions carried out tending to adhere Mexico to the Inter-American Convention on the Protection of Human Rights of Elderly People, adopted by the 45th session of the General Assembly of the OAS in June 2015. In this sense, the authorities of the government are aware that the current demographic aspect of Mexico demands to take actions to guarantee the respect and protection of the rights of elderly people, attending to specific needs of this important segment of our population. For that, we make sure we plant public policies which design and execution will move away from an existentialist view to move to one where elderly people are fully recognized as subjects of rights. In that sense, we consider that this hearing can be good to visualize even more the problematic that elderly adults face in our country that will heighten due to the elder population growing in the next following years. In that frame, I give the word to Sergio Valdez, in charge of the elderly people for the Institute INAPAM of Mexico, so he can illustrate the policy and regulation frameworks in favor of that group of the population, including what pertains their economical, social, and cultural rights, as well as the fight against discrimination and encouragement of inclusion. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, distinguished commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. Now I will talk about the aspects of national policies in terms of the rights of elderly people and elderly adults. In the wide aspect of the legal framework of the programs of on this matter, we will allow ourselves to give this commission the documentation that will facilitate the analysis on the applicable legal framework on the rights of elderly people that since 2002 has helped to the construction of a regulation system that favors the conditions of health, nutrition, housing, integral development, and integrity for this segment of the population. This law looks to improve the rights with policies that would allow a worthy and dignified movement of these people, oriented to strengthen their capacity to make decisions, their passive participation in productive processes in cultural and sport activities that will make them feel included, and to prevent discrimination due to their age and provide the ideal conditions for the full exercise of their rights. This ordinance contemplates the rights of elderly people to a life with quality without violence and discrimination, to a worthy treatment supported in any legal process, right to health, to food, to work and education, to social assistance, and to associate and participate in productive aspects, training in their communities, to denounce any act of omission that will violate the rights that the law gives them, and the preferable attention in public and private spaces. In the same manner, the law points out INAPAM as a public organism or body, decentralized, given the ownership of the defense or advocacy for elderly people. They have instruments like shelters, cultural spaces, in CAI and clubs. There are other laws that contemplate the right participation for the rights to health, the economical, social, cultural rights of people. The National Law of Health is part of this that considers basic services what pertains to the health assistance services. The Law of the Health Services designs the Elderly People Institute as the institute in charge of human resource investigation and to monitor the elderly and to take care of elderly people. In the same way, the Social Security law highlights the dispositions about the retirement, advanced retirement, and elderly development. To prevent discrimination, this is one of the main objectives for discrimination by age. The federal work law defines the concept of worthy work of that is respected or respects the dignity of the worker without discrimination by age, ensuring access to Social Security and a worthy salary. The General Law of Education establishes that in the educational system we take place of special primary and elderly people education if that elderly person has not gone through high school or elementary school. The cultural sector ensures that to exercise the cultural rights, the federal and state governments must establish actions that will encourage the celebration of agreements that will facilitate the access and enjoyment of goods, cultural goods, and spaces. We also highlight the right law for sports and physical health that includes sport in all its categories, including sports for elderly people. Finally, within the legal framework or regulation framework, there are several Mexican laws, official laws for the social assistance for elderly people in conditions of risk and vulnerability, promoting integral attention to the sector of the population as well as the access to health centers. An institutional center in APAM presides the National Council on this matter, which is comprised of 70 institutions, state agencies, academic agencies, and civil society together, and has as an objective to negotiate with the stakeholders the criteria and an inclusive state policy, the same which is replicated or in the different areas of the state. They developed the ontological document, which is a pioneer for the attention of elderly people in the way to strengthen the national strategy to attend this segment of the population. This program includes life expectancy, human rights approach, gender, disabilities, culture, recreational aspects, and economic independence, among other principles that would allow to reach a healthy and productive matter. It is important to highlight that the Institute counts with a council, a citizen council of elderly people that has as an objective to talk and dialogue on the actions and institutional services, as well as to take proposals on the matters that must be attended or strengthened for the adequate petition of this group. This council is formed by 10 elderly people of 60 years and older of extraordinary trajectory, equally divided by gender and with proper recognition by rights. On what pertains efforts and coordinations, the Committee of Attention to Elderly CONAIN, established in 2012, integrates the health sector, superior education, and civil organizations. Its structure is replicated in all the national territory through state councils for assistance to elderly, through which actions are taken in benefit of a healthy and productive life for elderly people. Regarding the economical, social, and cultural rights, different state agencies take actions in this means. The National Institute for Education, INEA, proposes educational models, performs researches, and spread educational documents to strengthen the learning process of adults, and it credits and certifies the basic education for adults, those of whom hadn't finished elementary school. The Mexican state has established commitments to attend the vulnerability aspects in which elderly people are currently in when they are looking for a job through the Work Ministry, we created the strategies opening spaces that has as an objective to reduce the difficulties that the population has to insert themselves on the labor market. These are operated by the National Service of Employment that give attention, personal attention, to determine if the person is receiving orientation or information for work-relating aspects, or if it must be channeled or trained occupationally in certain aspects. In some cases, we assess the competencies and abilities of the person to obtain a more complete work profile that would allow a better and longer insertion in the labor market in a job position that is in line with the capacities and knowledge of the elderly person. And it also guarantees that the employer must comply with the job opening that is being offered. Opening spaces, it is a strategy that offers assessment and advisory for the hiring of elderly people and positions also that can be adapted to be covered by that segment of the population, and to take advantage of human capital counted with social and company responsibility by giving employment to this group and benefiting at the same time with their experience. The Work Secretariat coordinates a network of work inclusion through which access is given to this vulnerable group to productive activities of the country. This national network is integrated by 32 state networks that work as a mechanism of coordination with organizations and public agencies and private institutions, company chambers and unions, and also civil society members on work matters, to acknowledge the work being done and the development of public policies of good practices and work-related issues on people that are in vulnerable states, including elderly people. The Work Secretariat gives companies and Gilberto Rincon Gallard the floor. For social inclusion, the Dominican state comes with contributive systems to cover retirement for salary workers and those people being a source of income through pensions, non-contributive pensions. We also encourage the voluntary savings so the people will receive a better pension and enjoy better treatment independently of this. We can, with the program Pension for Elderly Adults, managed by the Social Security Agency that attends people of 65 years and older, given economical and social protection and support. They receive economical support directly and participate on growth groups, social orientation campaigns, and informational sessions on personal and health development. Through this program, the beneficiaries obtain access to services and support of institutions like INAPAMP and the Popular Insurance. On its turn, the Health Ministry comes with a specific program for elderly attention, which objective is to establish a culture of healthy life with gender perspective and attending chronic diseases that are non-transmittable. The program establishes the use of prevention strategies, control, and attention for damage control of elderly people, which allows to group together efforts and organize the health services for a better capacity on response for different agencies of the government. For its development, we prioritize the actions of prevention and promotion of health and integration of success practices and innovational practices. This program looks to foment strategic alliances both with private initiatives and with the civil society, aside from a coordinated work inter-sector and between agencies for the betterment of the elderly adult. The National System for Family Care gives integral support to elderly people through the modalities of attention centers through the 365 days of the year, providing comprehensive attention that covers psychological health, social work, shelters, and food. The National Council Prevents Discrimination, CONAPRES. This is the agency in charge of the monitoring and implementation to prevent discrimination and promotes equality. This program includes all the federal administration and is a tool that articulates the political policies in agreement with the non-discrimination clauses of the United States of Mexico regulations. They establish modalities to fight discrimination by age through measures that promote equal society. This issue of actions that will prevent the exercise of rights and that will promote cultural change in favor of equality, the respect to diversity and inclusion, as well as harmonization in equal basis to guarantee the right and non-discrimination of elderly people. Lastly, in coordination with the National Institute of Women, our work secretariat implements Mexican rules on work and age equality, promoting the access to institutional benefits in an equal basis, ensuring the practice of equality and non-discrimination in work centers. Other institutions that give attention to elderly people with special programs are the ISTE, the National Forces, SEDENA, PEMIS, allowing, and I allow myself to return the floor to Ambassador Luis Cabañas for some references on the process of adhesion to the Inter-American Convention. From INAPAM, we are convinced of the importance of moving forward towards this adhesion that represents not only an affirmative actions in favor of elderly people, but will strengthen the public policies, the national policies on this matter. Mr. Ambassador. Excuse me, before passing the floor to Mr. Ambassador, some words, commissioners, Madam Chair, members of the civil society, to highlight the relevance of the economical policy that we have stated in Mexico with elderly people. Let me repeat a data that we believe is of the highest of relevance. Thanks to the policies that have been implemented in Mexico in this administration, we have developed 13.5 million of employment. 4.8% of this amount have corresponded to work for elderly people of 60 years or more. Means that today in the formal employment on the National Institute, we have registered 906 people over 60 years, like never before. This is a relevant data of this matter. This doesn't mean we are not aware of the challenge, but it is clear we are moving forward. The growth of the percentage of elderly adults in formal registry of employment in our administration is 38.9%. We are not going to lower our guards. We are going to keep on working, but we wanted to highlight this data that clearly reflects that our policies of inclusion are producing an effect. Thank you very much. Regarding the Inter-American Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Elderly People, Mexico participated actively in the negotiation process, involving in every moment the competent instances at a national level. Mexico favored that the instrument had a robust and ambitious mean to generate a true change in the framework of protection for elderly people. We have no doubt that the adoption of the convention was a major achievement in which we feel proud to have participated. Taking this into account, the Mexico state, through the Foreign Affairs Secretariat, started in 2016 the process of consultations with all institutions relating the current compliance of the treaty so they can analyze the budget and national compliance to this instrument and to pronounce our adhesion on the country. Right now, the Mexican Foreign Affairs Office in favor of the petition of public Secretariat is gathering specific information to determine the budgetary impact on the implementation of Articles 12, 17, and 24 of the Convention pertaining services of care, long-term care, Social Security, and rights to housing, respectively. In that sense, I want to highlight that no government official of the ministry has opposed in any moment for Mexico to be part of this convention. We are making the studies that are necessary, but what I have to say that no official of the Housing Secretariat has opposed for Mexico to be part of this convention. It is important to highlight that the part of the process that the judicial, legal, and executive power have held different meetings with the people, with the affected people on the Mexican part of this convention and the national initiatives that are currently being implemented in this process. We have stated in different forms that the rights contained in the convention are in coherence with our legal public policy framework, and they attend to the progression of rights and synthesis. Mexico is important, is aware of the importance of adhering to the convention once we identify thoroughly how we can comply with the corresponding principles. For that, this commission and other agencies of the country will be going important for the relevant appliance of the process described.
I will now invite my sister commissioner, the first vice president and country rapporteur for her intervention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My greetings and of a commitment and solidarity greetings to the organizations of the civil society that have allowed us today to gather such valuable information to the illustrate representation of the Mexican state. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share important information, but I want to highlight the transcendence of this hearing because it allows us all, the continent, to start assessing what represents the justiciability of the economical, social, and cultural rights. The matter of the hearing, and I know I don't have a lot of time to express all the elements that I wished I could, but I want to highlight, and that's the question. This is the question I would do. Both presentations have made an accuracy on the big commitments on to the right of work, right to health, right of education, to culture, to sports, the gender perspective, housing, food. What I would like to hear from both parties, which will be, if there is an entire institutional structure, there is very valuable information from studies. That's what it's reflected here. The difficulties of articulating, if there is a health program, this needs to be linked to the program, to the work program, to the housing program, meaning how, as you can see, the difficulties or the possibilities of articulating institutionally the effectiveness of a response that a population is demanding, that it's really good that there is a better or higher life expectancy. That is a positive element of the population and of our people, but we know that implies the big challenge for the comprehensive attention of these people. So it seems to me there is an important point in the need that all involved sectors, and we have been able to see that all of them are involved, you must have a point of articulation that would allow the effectiveness of the rights. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Right, my sister, Rapporteur Flavia, who is in charge of the unit, a new unit established in the Commission to deal with the rights of elderly persons. Thank you.
Buenos días.
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to participate of this historical moment for the Commission. As head of the unit on the rights of elderly people, my deepest greetings to the representation of the civil society, very well qualified, and the representation of the state with very clarifying inputs and valuable inputs. My first observation is that this hearing seems historic to me based on two arguments. For dealing the elderly from the perspective of human rights, the approach of human rights, and not the existential approach, meaning we are here pushing a new view, a paradigm shift, a cultural change on the political attitudes of practice, and moreover having the approach of the social, economical, and cultural rights on its direct application to an immediate implementation. Also, my second observation to how the head of this new unit in our strategic plan, the goal number one is precisely to push the process of ratification of the Inter-American Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Elderly People. We have so far 5 countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. The convention took effect in January 2017, and it would be very relevant to have Mexico due to all its protagonism and starring on the process of adoption. So we are waiting for all the consultations, the process that Mr. Ambassador cleared for Mexico, because for the spreading of standards to change, to strengthen the dignity, the respect of the human rights of elderly people. My question, it seems essential here for the civil society with all the statistics on work right, health right, housing, education, the pension issues, the violence issues too, the topic of the generation of segregated data. Because on the field of education, we have 60% of elderly people, illiterate people, but in this universe, 73% women, meaning from the perspective of the Commission, it is very important to visualize, aside from the statistics, the people in terms of gender, men, women, ethnicity, race, age, why. With this aggregated data, we have a precise diagnostic that would allow public policies that are focused, more accurate, to face the topics of discrimination, cultural differences, and guaranteeing rights. So my question to the representatives of the state of Mexico that honored us with your presence and participation, it's precisely the object of generating this aggregated data capable of making an impact on the formulation of public policies that are more suitable. Thank you very much.
My brother Commissioner, former President of the Commission, Mr. Francisco Eguri.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Due to time reasons, I give my space to my colleagues. I thank the Special Rapporteur on Economical, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Invite our the Special Rapporteur on this issue, these rights here, which we are discussing, to intervene.
Thank you very much, Madam Presidenta. Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, representatives of the civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the representative of Mexico, the audience here present. To me, as rapporteur, it's an honor to accompany this hearing. Like Commissioner Flavia mentioned, head of the Elderly People Unit. It is historic, which is supposed to introduce in our system a debate to everyone knowledge that necessary and a dialogue that is necessary. And I trust this is only the beginning of this hearing to continue to strengthen more the links between the Mexican civil society, the Mexican state, and of course with the support of the Commission and yours special rapporteurship on economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights. So I will gladly put at the service of the civil society and the state for that visit or articulate work on the strengthening of public policies and actions of the Mexican state in this important matter for the public center and the national center that are concerned, and that definitely if everything is right in our life, we will all become those people throughout our life road. And therefore, and not because of that only, that topic is extremely important, but the biggest concern for this rapporteurship that works the desk from an indivisible, this is the interconnection with the political rights and human rights that are encouraged by the international and national protection agencies, and I highlight the valuable information provided by the civil society with this non-division society of the DESCA and the political rights, precisely with the access of justice, that it just cannot work in another way. I would like to underline the value of the information received from the state on what is the deployment, the institutional deployment on this matter, and some data in nature for this, in economical nature for this rapporteur. It would be important to have them. Mainly, what are the budgetary expenditure that we have in matters of human rights, and more concretely on elderly adults. And if I may give a reflection first on the importance, and the representative of the state was highlighting this, that Mexico participated so actively on the adoption of this historic convention of our system, but also the educational importance that the processes have towards the ratification of these instruments, like the civil society highlighted. It is a huge opportunity for the state of Mexico in this commitment and these measures that tend to make a reality the human rights of the entire population throughout all their life cycle. The process that will take us to the ratification of this convention by the state of Mexico, and without harm to the necessary studies and that are necessary to be done to know what are going to be the budgetary expenses. Myself, from a non-debatable perspective of rights, I would like for this type of exercises to be done pertaining all conventions, because they all represent a budgetary expense. And in that same sense, to put myself to the service, I would like to call the attention that this commission, on its important historical value, it is a change on the coding of international rights, that many, if not all, of the international obligations it contains are already international obligations in place for the Mexican state by ratifying the other international instruments. So in that sense will be to deepen more those obligations, understanding that not only the economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights are progressive, but also that they have a group of basic rights. And I leave on the table my special concern on the rights of food, of the health of elderly people in Mexico, and my interest in having more information about that topic, especially after listening to this standard marked by the Supreme Court of Justice of the nation regarding the line of the minimum well-being, which would be $76 per month, but however, nowadays that would not reach $30 to $45 every 3 months. That is a concern topic for us to keep on talking and working in favor of its improvement. And another matter that concerns me, along with the gender perspective, is the matter of cultural diversity that unfortunately Mexico has. How these matters can be worked with more cultural ownership pertaining the original indigenous people of Mexico. Thank you very much.
Take 50 seconds to make a couple of comments because I adopt what my colleagues have stated, and I thank civil society and the illustrious states representative for your fulsome and informative presentations. I just wanted to mention that one of the things which concerned me, I don't think I heard about it, it might have been mentioned, is the emotional good health of elderly, which has to be considered. So many elderly persons have lost their lifelong partners, spouses, and go through periods of serious depression, not mental illness, but depression. And they need an outlet for the usable recreational facilities in order to maintain good health. And also that states very often, not only Mexico, but other states, forget the value of elderly persons, which they still have and can give to their communities because of their experiences in life, which is a true value of development in learning what happened in the past and building from it. And so they can be brought into the picture. And I highlight the request for disaggregated data, which informs especially the state to understand what is necessary to provide for all the minority groups in the country, especially because the majority groups are normally better taken care of, but the minority groups of indigenous, Afro-descendants, disabled persons, LGBTI, and others. And in that disaggregated data must be included the family structure of each of these elderly persons, which is very vitally necessary to inform the state what facilities should be provided and so on. And I will leave my comments there, but we would be thankful for further information in writing from both sides to continue considering this. Now, since we started late and we're running out of time to start the next one, I'm afraid I can only give 3 minutes for your responses. So 3 minutes to civil society, starting now.
Yes, it's good that we put the emphasis on the need of articulating a public policy pertaining elderly adults. INAPAM is the leading body. However, it's not working at all. We have, again, institutions that are white elephants, part of the simulation that we live for a while now. Because there is not even the superior audition of the Federation on its assessment of this institution states what INAPAM doesn't do. So that's data. Of course, we have to disaggregate data. It is said there are a lot of people now that through the work secretariat have an activity. Most of them are also packaging people on supermarkets. So we would need to see exactly what are we talking about. What is the time lapse these people work, the time frame, and with what salary are they being given. So in effect, there are no disaggregated data. What we have given now in the case of access to justice is because we are doing research on this matter, precisely to know what is happening on the justice aspect. And that's one example. But in effect, what we need is for the state to provide with greater details the data that we are missing or lacking from them. INAPAM, well, seems to me that has more than 330 million of budget, out of which 60% goes out in staff. So there is a 40% alone for recreational matters, and I don't think that is what the population needs. Yes, they do, but not like that. Yes, I would like to add to this what my colleague Rocio mentioned of precisely there is a lack of linking and articulation from the head body that marks the adults or elderly people it must put them all together, all institutions, so they can be on the same line of the national policy. From the civil society, we feel there is not a well-defined national policy. What there are social programs, yes, that many times are not supported by a law. Just on the Mexico City is supported the food pension by a law. So administration come and go, and we see a lot that the attention to elderly people depends on the will, the political will of the person or the government official sitting there. There is not a public policy. On what relates to the employment, the work offer, yes, but we have seen recent statistic data where precisely that employment is to low, very low profiles, and that is the same what happens with elderly people. Thank you.
Please. Thank you.
Well, the INAPAM is always willing to find or articulate to different entities, state, federal, and by municipalities and civil society and academic agencies. We work with a council that meets every 2 months that groups 56 institutions. Some of you have assisted to this council, and we look to generate public policy for this population group. There is a diversity of programs through the different government secretariats, the different institutions of the government. We all have the misinformation of everything being done in the country in favor of elderly people. I think there is improvement. We've been dedicated to this elderly people study or betterment. And I personally have seen progress. We have coordination with institutions now. That there's a lot still to do. I am sure of it. Elderly people population increase every time and increase more. Not all elderly adults wants to work or is going to work without people. We have people over 80, 90, and 100 years of age, and we need to give a different attention of care. Long-term care. Well, I think we are doing things the best way possible, but yes, there is a limited budget. Surely it's not only spent in social, cultural, or sport programs. We apply it to different situations, and we look through this audit that was done not only to INAPAM but to all institutions that have actions towards elderly people. And some dispositions were pointed out to all of us so we can comply with this response. We take the commitment of articulating this policy, and we have to do it with the support and the help of all the involved sectors. To complement, I would say 4 or 5 things trying to answer their questions. We have the law since 2002, but there is a group of general laws that affect in a positive way the situation of elderly people, the health, right, the education, health, all of which were mentioned. The important is to move towards the non-existential approach, and here I want to mention a good practice. Since we approved the Sustainable Law 2030, the government of the Republic changed the way the budget is being made, and all the common governments, while the law remains, need to take into consideration the objectives and goals of the development of the 2030 agenda. And therefore, the federal budget must be created based on the objectives and goals of the 2030 agenda. This is a good practice that I hope will impact all local governments. Of course, we are going to implement by writing. I have here, I don't know, 200 pages of data, and I wouldn't want to take more time, but I don't
think, and with all due respect here with our friends from civil society, I don't believe that there is just a simulation. There are steps that have been taken forward. It is not enough, but there is leadership, there is a vision, and together we can do much more. Thank you.
who have attended here today, and members of representatives of the illustrious state of Mexico. We thank you for your presentations, and we look forward to learning that Mexico has ratified the convention in the very, very near future. Thank you very much. This hearing is at an end. The next one starts at in 5 minutes, yes. Thank you very much. Hello, good morning. We are now about to start our second hearing before this panel. And this hearing is on the situation of defenders of victims of torture in Mexico. And it was requested by civil society. I would ask you, civil society, if you can introduce yourselves as you speak for the record. I don't want to abuse any of your names. And it's good to see the illustrious state of Mexico here fulsomely represented in this matter. Each party shall have 15 minutes for your initial presentation, and then we will have comments from the panel or questions, and then we will have a few minutes for your closing statement. With that, I invite you, and I will mark the time when you have only 5 minutes and 3 and 1. So with that, if we can commence with civil society. Thank you.
Good morning, commissioners, ladies, gentlemen, representatives of the Mexican government and audience. My name is Federico Rodriguez of the Mexican Commission for Defense and Promotion of Human Rights. This hearing is going to be segmented in the following. My participation will talk about the general context of torture in Mexico. I will afterwards give the word to Eduardo Cardeño and José Alberto Casares, who will provide their testimony of criminalization and consequences they have undergone by reporting acts of torture. Afterwards, then, in the representation of CIDH and the Organization Against Torture, we'll talk about the importance of publicly acknowledging torture victims and the need of implementing key components of the general torture law to protect and repair victims. Finally, Nancy Lopez is going to talk about the criminal situation that we are facing as organizations to follow up on cases of torture, and we'll actually then go into detail of what we bring. As this commission knows, torture in Mexico is one of the main topics that affect deep violation to human rights. This is a regular and ongoing practice, and worse so, it is still common among the law enforcement entities in different levels of the government. The 16 sentences that have been issued by the federal government from 2006 to this date are the exception to the over 9,000 torture investigations cases that have taken place on behalf of the government, which means that impunity still remains in our country. To understand what we are saying, in Mexico in 2006, we implemented a security policy to try to battle organized crime against the comes from the national territory, and behind the torture and manufacture of those responsible has showing the failure of the institutions to try to create effective resources against the violence that is affecting us. Corruption, impunity, and the efficiency and the inefficiency in the research of felonies has caused institutional efforts to go away from the legal aspects by using arbitration, torture, and abuse of individuals that have been detained in front of the media. For example, between 2008 and 2011, in the city of Mexico, the local prosecutor's office created a financial stimulus package to the officers that would detain the criminals, which generated arbitrary and illegal detentions of individuals as long as they could obtain those benefits. This practice was also implemented at a federal level without having an understanding of whether this continues to take place. All of these are reflected in the case of Mr. Hugo Martinez Buenos Dias, who on October 29 of 2008, when he left his work as a food delivery guy, was detained without order by officers of the Capitalina Procureur Office. He was forced to strip. They harmed his genitals. They almost choked him with a bag and burned him to burn him alive if he did not confess to participating in the kidnapping of 2 individuals that he did not know. He was forced to acknowledge his felonies and confess to them to then present him in front of the press as the leader of a kidnapper ring. It was 2015 when he was still in prison that he was able to denounce a local procurer's office, but then months afterwards his wife was victim of harassment. But she has been denied effective measures of security. Cases such as this have a negative impact on the judicial system and doesn't let them review evidences obtained in cases of torture, because then they would be publicly marked as criminal releasers, which hinders the capability of helping those who are actually innocent and makes them an accomplice of the systematization of torture and works with victims and violations of human rights. That is what I wanted to add, and I give the floor to Mr. Garduño. Good morning, my name is Gerardo Garduño Escobar, and I work in Baja California, Mexico, in Tijuana. For 15 years, I was a municipal officer, which is a task that I performed with love, knowing that the context of security in the municipality of Tijuana year after year has continued to deteriorate as a result of organized crime, as we are saying, and that it was brought in to show this in streets. I was actually a victim of torture on behalf of the National Secretariat, along with 24 of my partners who were also municipal officers. We were illegally detained, brought into the military compound, and submitted to long sessions of torture with the intent of getting us to confess to organized crimes against health and gun trafficking. Among the victims, there was a female that were also affected by the situation. Those who were victims were acknowledged for a freedom release order and others in 2010 and 2013. Despite the fact that we were found innocent then, our lives have been damaged by this because we have been criminalized as a result. The authorities working alongside the municipality of Tijuana were the ones responsible for our detention and torture, and we have seen that they have not suffered any consequences or legal repercussions, even though some of the responsibles, despite instead of being sanctioned, they have actually been awarded, such as the Secretary of Public Safety, Mr. Sahuola, who was named the Manager of Public Safety at the time. In Mexico, showing that someone has committed a felony normally doesn't show any legal consequence, but the aspects that are suffered by the victims are irreparable, and this is something that also our families go through when they report, such as the case of my former wife, who was also threatened on 2 occasions at gunpoint by showing her pictures of our children in the school, our parents, and these were also crimes that we're reporting. And up to this point, these are still only filed in the Secretariat. We have 9 years worked in this process to try to improve, take over back our lives. We see that nothing has actually been done in this regard, and we continue to face the victimization and the stigmatization of this. One of our colleagues was even actually murdered, and because of this, we brought our case to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. And to this day, we continue to look forward for someone to help and to aid us in the damages that we have suffered and how our lives have been affected, and to explain to the societies what we have faced, and to show that the authorities are the ones that in action violated the law. Because in Mexico, you are first guilty, you are locked up, you are tortured, and then you are investigated. I do hope that with this hearing, the Mexican state can now hear, listen to our demands, and repair the damages that we have gone through. We demand justice. Thank you so much, and I give the floor to my partner.
Good morning. My name is Jose González Salinas, resident of City, Mexico. My daughter was detained in the year 2011 by people from the federal police, tortured physically and psychologically and sexually, in order for her to declare guilty of the crime of kidnapping. After her detention, she ended up with the responsibility, the alimony, and the expenses of their children. Her daughter was only 6 years old when she was separated from her mother. Her detention, after I denounced it from the first day, I was witness of the events were carried out in a way and time that were different, that the police pointed out in their information the truth of her detention and the reality and the acting of the authorities have been proven and recognized by the Commission of Human Rights to eradicate violence against women, and even who decided to carry out the criminal actions against them, and the responsibles that even though there are solid proof of the fabrication of this case against her. My daughter has been in temporary prison for almost 7 years without clearly knowing until when will the family torture end, because the legal authorities have prolonged their criminal process, her criminal process. It has been a burden, this legal process against my daughter, taking care of her children, and to have to fight against the state who has fabricated evidence against her. Now I have to assume the dishonor, the criminalization provoked by a group of people who have gone or given press releases supporting the version given by the federal police to her alleged criminality, ignoring all of the evidence that exists in favor, exposing her to a social trial and an unfair trial anticipated that hurts her children and her whole family, avoiding that the legal process concludes objectively. The only thing that I want is a fair and impartial trial, and soon, because it has been almost 7 years since she has been in prison without a sentence, criminalizing her and dishonoring her socially. In this case, all of the evidence had to be excluded, all of the evidence used and obtained under torture, violating her rights and due process. Finally, I would like to present that in the past few weeks, suspicious vehicles have followed me outside of my house. In the past few days, I have denounced this situation, expecting that the protection measures that are necessary are given to me, are provided to me. Thank you very much for listening to me. Good morning, my name is Florencia Regiardo, representing Sehile and OMCT. As you have heard from the testimony rendered here, there is a growing trend in the Mexican current scene to stigmatize victims of torture and the people that are denouncing it. There is an emptiness on behalf of the Mexican state that is contributing to victimization and the stigma of being identified as a criminal. They are denied of being a person, survival of torture, and sometimes they're consolidated as a de facto obstacle that is preventing them to obtain their freedom. The Executive Commission of Attention to Victims could play a role with a psychosocial perspective of attention to torture victims. In the practice, there are limitations. In order for this to intervene and provide its multidisciplinary services, in the first place, we need to have the quality of the victim established as the victim general law. This could only be obtained by legal decision or determined by certain public agencies. Then the National Registry of Victims, RENAVI, is an institution that works under SENAB, has a really high number of victims. Such institution takes more than a year only issuing a registry. But the victims that have received measures of rehabilitation and attention, they receive that in a dispersed way, in constant way, and not sufficient after a great amount of administrative that generate actions that generate long periods of waiting time. This has been recognized by a judge. These victims have been by forces of the order, and in parallel, they suffer the stigmatization with close links with legal power and the media, which increases the risk of suffering attacks. In this same sense, it's very important to implement as soon as possible the expected measure to prevent, investigate, and sanction torture in relation to victims of torture established by Article 93 to 95. Until today, the victim attention programs have not been approved. so important, as I've said previously, is that the Mexican state not only respects and protects victims of torture, but the highest authorities, the President of the Republic, the Governance Secretary, as the General Attorney of the Republic, recognize them publicly in such quality. We need a recognition of that style and the commitment of working in order for them to be repaired. This is the first step for them to start in the Mexican context, to feel treated as people with rights and not criminals. This is a step that has a zero cost that will increment immediately the security of the victims and their defenders. In this context, it's crucial that the competent authorities condemn and take measures to sanction against victims and stigmatization against the victims. Is a commitment of Mexico with the prohibition of torture and questions the real willingness to comply with the spirit and the general law of torture. I give the word to my colleague, Nancy Lopez. Thank you very much.
I am Nancy Lopez in the Inter-American Commission, and here at the Inter-American Commission of Promotion of Human Rights have been victim of criminalization and consequence of their defense labor, and then the follow-up for cases of torture. So via the conferences that we see in the interviews of communication and media of civil organizations that are close to the government, as well as public officers have given interviews where they have confirmed that those who defend victims of torture are recurrent headlines as weapons who defend organized crime or encrusted in power. This affects the exercise and implementation of our meanings, and this places at risk. It places a risk in our integrity or honor, and because it presents us as lawyers of criminal groups who seek to enrich financially as damage repair on their part. Because of their deceiving nature, these individuals seek to confuse society, which in a society such as the Mexican one affects the impacts on information. And it is important to highlight that the means that have been provided by the entities of human rights are not efficient in acts of criminalization, stigmatization, because the panic button, the infrastructure measures do not revert a slander campaign against us. Efforts to see that the human rights campaign in terms of the importance of this are of course a first effort, but this is something that we need to take into account. And in this situation we request this Inter-American Human Rights Commission to urge the Mexican state first to try a constitutional reform so that it can create a professional, independent process with the capability of working with torture cases. It is obviously important for this to withdraw the armed forces in any public safety manner, and it is also important for federal prosecutor's office when any other authorities will attain to question any of the authorities that deport torture and that cause a damage, and the importance of protecting the right of the torture victims, as well as supporting the organizations and individuals who help defend their rights. This is finally a petition to the Inter-American system is to follow up on the petitions. Every time that we see impunity lived in Mexico, this Inter-American system is the last hope that we have of thousands of people that are unjustly condemned.
"30 seconds. More than your... not not only. No, not only. Could the illustrious state please start, Mr. Ambassador? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, distinguished commissioners, appreciated representatives, ladies and gentlemen. We greet and we reiterate the Commission for the follow-up Regarding the topic of the grant, we see that we have acknowledged in several occasions in terms of defense of human rights for the conciliation of our democracy, of the rule of law, and for stronger institutions by condemning any act doomed to stigmatize the human rights of those individuals who defend and journalists, and to pay special attention to those groups that are at risk. In that sense, I allow myself to briefly highlight the recent efforts of the Mexican state to acknowledge the work of those who are defending human rights. First of all, I want to highlight the intervention of the President of the Republic, Mr. Enrique Peña Nieto, in the ceremony of Human Rights Awards in 2016, where he emphasized the promotion and protection of defense of fundamental rights as something that brings us all together. For this, I do want to reiterate the commitment working jointly with authorities, activist leaders, and defenders. In this sense, we also see the role of work in the 45th extraordinary period of hearings in the Inter-American Court held in Mexico City, through which we showed the federal process, where we talked about human rights and the importance of the new challenges that we see. In January of last year, the Secretary also performed a follow-up with the individuals for human rights in defense of individuals called by the National Human Rights Commission and the High Commissioner Office for the United Nations, where we participated as a special rapporteur for the UN pertaining the situation of the defenders of human rights. In the same way, the Mexican state has acknowledged the work of human rights and the importance for mechanisms and protection of individuals for human rights and journalists, and the Human Rights Watch report. Additionally, in the multilateral forums of human rights, the state has supported with sponsorship numerous initiatives for human rights, and in the acknowledgement, especially in the General Assembly and in the General Assembly for the Organization of American States. In the case of the framework of the 37th period session for hearing of the United Nations in February of this year, I reiterated on behalf of the Mexican government the acknowledgement of the work of the defenders of human rights, who, working on an activity which is a pillar of the Mexican democracy, have done this. Even in the period for ordinary hearing, we see that the Mexican state has highlighted the work of human rights advocacy of journalists and individuals because of their contribution to the democracy in the country, and the commitment of the Mexican state was reiterated for the protection of human rights. In this sense, it is key for the Mexican state to look at the importance and strengthening of this work, as well as to ensure that this takes place without risk in a favorable environment. We are also working for the strengthening in the aspect of investigation by creating a tool not only for the potential victims in terms of access to justice, but also to allow us to prevent this from further happening. Before I give the floor to the Human Rights Secretariat of the Office of Information, Mr. Rafael Alvarez Duarte, I allow myself, on behalf of the Mexican government, to once more reiterate the acknowledgement of the work to those that are defending human rights in Mexico, as well as to highlight the commitment of the state to continue to implement new efforts towards highlighting the importance of your work and to fully ensure your safe being, well-being as part of the pillar of the democracy in Mexico. I give the floor to Rafael Lavala, Secretariat. Thank you, Commission, its Executive Secretary, representatives of the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, the Strategic Council for Human Rights and Peace, the Justice Rights Council and Legal Assistance for Human Rights of the World Organization Against Torture and Impunity. We share the great concern that has been mentioned here in terms of the slander, stigmatization, and misqualification of those that are defending victims of torture and victims of violations of human rights. Very specifically, the situation of the victims, of whom we continue to reiterate the support to those with our comprehensive services. As members of the government, we do want to offer a close follow-up of this. When we report and have clear assessment of the rights such as torture and denigrating human action, the state is forced to take swift measures for the sanction and complete eradication, acting swiftly against those who perpetrate these felonies, never against those who very valiantly have helped a victim in the defense of their rights. We must not lose sight of the fact that Mexico today has a law that protects those individuals who defend human rights and journalists. A regulation that in item 44 demands the promotion publicly and socially of these important activities. To pretend to restrict or to inhibit this capability is the equivalent to for us to break the right and to ensure impunity. We need to ensure that these take place, that we have a due process that will respect legality and integrity, and this does not in any shape, way, or form means that we are hindering the rights and responsibilities of those. Because of this, the government of Mexico will reject and disapprove false accusations against our defense of human rights in the sense of us defending criminals or that we are trying to enrich ourselves in lieu of those that have been affected. We respond by saying that no one can not follow up, prosecute, and work on felonies and to use them as a harassment tool against those individuals defending human rights, or to not allow for this to happen. In the same sense, nobody can forgo human rights and use this as an excuse to commit felonies. In the same sense, the promotion and defense of human rights needs to be a tool for a culture of legality. In the same sense, the process that we have, the defense that we have for the journalists and individuals to ensure their wellness. Right now, this mechanism has under protection 2 individuals, of which 56% are the defenders of human rights and 44% are journalists. The mechanisms have active participation, ongoing participation of civil society, who not only launched for the creation of it, but are also members of this entity. We see that this is comprised by 4 institutions of the federal government, 2 entities, and a representative of the National Commission for Human Rights. Additionally, 9 defenders and journalists are part of a council which participates in the overview of documents who approve by the board, as well as all the actions with individuals who benefit from this mechanism, and then protection plans are approved. The civil society organizations also actively follow up in this mechanism and the decision-making process through the space granted by civil society for the protection of individuals, of human rights, and journalists, and this is known as the OSC space. This is integrated by 8 civil organizations, among them the Inter-American Human Rights Promotion Entity, which has a permanent work agenda. It is relevant to highlight that the government board for this mechanism approved in 2008 the guidelines to acknowledge individuals and human rights, which were aligned, and of course of which we now read and give them to the Commission. So we are working with public servers with the intention of following up and implementing those criteria to create messages for the explicit acknowledgement of the work of those who are defending human rights. In this document, we work on the 3 government instances, including the condemnation of those that work with actions of harassment against those who defend human rights and journalists, providing sanctions to the work as well as those who are slandering those professionals. It is important also to add to the local government, and of course the President made a call to create an emerging strategy for national protection, not only federal, which transformed into actions that are provided for those individuals in human rights. As a follow-up, we created then also items to follow up against the protection of those individuals for human rights, where we participate the protection mechanism. So the coordination of the state's units has continued to become stronger with time, and this is a valuable strategy with the intention of operating this message. To follow up with coordination, we have performed 3 meetings with the members of the entities of the state.
Finally, this must be the opportunity and the space to reiterate our wide and sincere acknowledgement, public acknowledgement, to the courageous and deliberate work of the people and organizations that defend human rights, that protect victims and their families, and that makes for the search of justice and truth their reason to live. This noble, valuable, and legitimate work deserves all our support and accompaniment, all our support and protection, never to diminish it, and not even to mention to defend it. I give the floor to the Attorney General of the Republic. A decisive action of the Mexican state to fight torture is the law to prevent, sanction, torture, and other inhuman, degrading, or cruel treatment. This is an inclusive project through public consultation and work tables with the participation of the federal government, the federal agencies, representative of the judicial power, academies, and organizations of the civil society, and several human rights bodies. In this law, we foresee the imprescriptibility of the criminal sentence and the constitutional felonies of the torture crime, and the nullity of the proof in cases of proven of this such crime, and the right to defend human rights. In order to defend this law, PGR has done the following actions: issued the protocol for the investigation of torture crime that was approved on the Attorney General's Commission, the special sentencing to torturing crimes that's replaced the previous unit, and the fact of accounting with a special office increases the capabilities of prosecution for this type of crime, working on a program to prevent and sanction torture, and elaborating the new profiles for the service, for the public service officials to count with the experience and knowledge in the investigation of these crimes. These actions have counted with the collaboration and follow-up of the National Commission on Human Rights through the National Mechanism of Torture Prevention. On the other hand, the Prosecutor Office of the Republic has adopted instruments on the National Conference of Justice for the heads of the different prosecution offices and Attorney General's office of the states of the Mexican Republic. It is of great interest to Mexico to count with an instrument in favor of those exercising this important job of defending human rights. This is the reason we are developing a protocol for investigation of crimes committed against advocates of human rights, guiding the actions of substantial people and staff seeking justice. This including the social, migrational, indigenous, health, age, and gender situation of the person. This is why through a work group created by the group Fray Candelarios Group Forum for Human Rights Advocate, Civil Casa Hitla Sehil PGR, the Governance Secretariat, the Senate of the Republic, the CIDH, and you say it through the program Pro Voices, we are making a job for fact. February 6th, we carried out the first talk or dialogue with experts, advocates of human rights, and authorities with experience on this matter. And starting from there, we will elaborate the final version of the protocol. In this protocol, we'll look to comply with the guidelines in the case Valle Jaramillo and others against Colombia, where the Inter-American Court on Human Rights made valid this obligation of protecting the advocates of human rights, with 4 duties: to facilitate the necessary means for those defending human rights to carry out freely their activities, to protect them when they are subject to threats, to prevent attempts against their life and integrity, and to oppose the obstacles that will prevent them from making their actions, as well as investigating thoroughly the accusations and threats against their work. The work group has noted that the protocol must count with the profile of people who are defenders of human rights and the context on which they carried out their advocacy work and the interest, the nature of the investigation linked to the defense activities, the right of being informed of this investigation, the respect to international standards of due diligence, due process, and right to the defense, the confidentiality of investigations, the right of the victims, and the gender perspective, intercultural and differentiated approach to guaranteed. Lastly, I just want to reiterate, as has been expressed, that the transcendence of the work carried out by the human rights defenders must never be seen as a work that is contrary to the justice delivery mechanisms. We consider them an ally to do our jobs.
Thank you very much to the illustrious state of Mexico. I now invite the country rapporteur of Mexico, my sister Commissioner Esmeralda, to do her interventions.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I again salute or greet in this opportunity the representation of the civil society that allows us today to gather valuable information in this important topic. To the authorities, illustrated authorities of the state of Mexico, to the audience here present, to those who follow us on social media, and I particularly want to thank the appreciation of the Commission to the state of the Dominican Republic for giving us the opportunity of celebrating these hearings in this beautiful country. The topic at hand is a complex topic. It's a difficult one. We have listened the part of the petitioners of this hearing where I want to truly point out about the situation, the criminalization situation of the people who have been victims of torture. And in relation to what was stated by the state, that effectively we have to acknowledge that there is an entire process of work of creating protocols and documents for the effectiveness of the recently approved law and enacted law against torture, because I believe there is a connecting element that is very important there in the way that the the investigation of the act of torture and the implications of them for the victims and the responses that the justice system is committed by this law to provide in terms of the investigation in general as fast as possible, as expedited. How, on behalf of the state, the number of denouncers or claims that are relating to this type of crime, and precisely a crime where its executioners are agents of the state. What is the relation or the organization that the state has right now to achieve, to complete the work that requires the particular responses of the judicial system in the investigations and, of course, the sanctions? Here we have heard the law has this projection for the prevention with an entire work plan, but there is also the part of the sanctions to the perpetrators of these facts. So a little bit of that approach. How is right now the response? Because what we heard from the petitioner's side is that there hasn't been a response in the terms that the law itself foresees. So I would like in that line of thought to listen the position of the state. Thank you.
My brother, Commissioner and former President, Mr. Francisco Eguren, for his comment.
Thank you, Mrs. President.
As rapporteur for rights of human rights defenders, and due to time, I would like to be very accurate to the point in my questions to the representatives of the state and the civil society. To the state, the civil society organizations have expressed here that torture constitutes a generalized and constant practice on the actions of the forces in charge of fighting crime activities. I would like to know if for the state, if this is assumed as a problem and a reality. And second, we have been explained different laws and protocols and institutions that have been created and have been implemented to face these problems of torture and protection to their victims. I'm sure here we don't have the information, but I would like to know if you can send us or give us an advance or in concrete data, in numbers, about actions of the state to sanction and not leave in impunity the existence of these practices of torture. It is comforting having heard here that the state manifests not taking part or place or backing up this type of campaigns or exercise to actions of civil society organizations or victims of torture. It is important for this to be done in different forums and moreover within the Mexican society. For the civil society, I would like to ask two things on the insecurity context. The citizen insecurity context and citizen context. Sometimes populations polarize their analysis or societies. I would like to know if the organizations, defenders of victims of torture, have some sort of criteria to select or exclude the cases which defense and promotion you assumed or any matter that approaches you. Bottom line, what are your criteria to assume the advocacy of some victims of torture if there are all of them are accepted or some are excluded? And lastly, I think due to time concerns, I'll leave it there.
Commissioner Flavia to make her interventions.
Thank you, President. Una vez más.
Once again, I would like to greet again the representation of the civil society and the representation of the state for this important moment of clarifying the severity of the problem of torture. I have two questions. The first relating the duty to investigate autonomously and independently according to the Istanbul Protocol, meaning the principles of the protocol are implemented, and how we guarantee the measures of the state to ensure the right, the duty to investigate with autonomy and independence. I would also like to know, aside from the law of prevention and sanctioning of torture that you mentioned in your process as a strong and relevant democratic component of consultations, if aside from this law there is institutionality like national or mechanisms or national committees of prevention and fighting against torture and the mechanisms for prevention. I remembered Najaroli, rapporteur for the torture topic, he always stated torture is a crime of opportunity. We have to eliminate the opportunity of torture, meaning how do we ensure the transparency, the monitoring, and how other commissioners mentioned the effective fight against impunity. My other concern has to do with the victims, the protection, and the repair, the comprehensive repair policy for the victims. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank both the civil society and the representatives of the illustrious state of Mexico for their very informative presentations. I just want to make a couple of comments and hope that we can have some more and additional information on this matter, because we clearly need some more information, and I adopt the requests of my panel members and will not repeat those, hopefully. I just wanted to say this, that I'm very concerned about statements made by members of the political directorate in relation to persons who are alleged to have committed certain offenses. This is a matter that came up a number of times when I was a member of the court, the Inter-American Court, and to hear that from civil society that these still happen, because I think it is inherent of the state to provide a legislative provision that in relation to persons alleged to have committed offenses, which may have a political component or not. I know politicians can get carried away whilst they're on a platform addressing members of the public, but there should be some legislation which says that the identity of these people who are merely alleged and haven't been convicted should not be disclosed, so that the identities of their families are also out there in the public, because it endangers them and it is contrary to the presumption of innocence. because until they are actually convicted of the offense, they have not, and it has not been proven that they have committed it. So the one should not be subjected to torture, and nor should their identities be mentioned in a way which the public takes that Mr. A is guilty of kidnapping, is guilty of armed robbery or what have you. That should not happen, and it's inherent on the state to do so. It's also inherent on the state to ensure that all the requirements of due process are followed in relation to the investigation of any offense, however serious the offense is. They must ensure that due process requirements are followed. So in relation to that, I just wanted to ask, could you give us information as to the actual training which the state gives to its officers in relation to the strict follow-up of requirements for due process in investigation, and how long that training lasts, and what level of officers receive that training, and how many of the force receive it. And also, if you have the data, and if not, if you can put in place the mechanism for the data to ensure that the Commission has information as to how many persons have been tortured in the last 3 years who were alleged to have committed offenses, and in relation to what offenses. With that, I now offer 3 minutes to civil society and 3 minutes to the state to make your closing addresses, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you. Yes.
Well, to answer the Commissioner, we select the cases based on those that we identified as common owners of the policy of torture crimes, meaning that have been tortured by state agency, in particular military people or members of the national defense or local police officers, who are the ones that we have accompanied and found. Next, we believe it's fundamental to highlight that we must not discriminate torture cases from the state or the authorities, because that deepens the criminalization, and furthermore, this leaves in a state of unprotection hundreds of thousands of victims. We would also like to point out that according to the question on the Istanbul Protocol, currently the unit of the Attorney General's Office of the Republic that investigates cases of torture is working at a minimum. Meaning there are very few public ministries with training to understand what the protocol states. And in the last few months, we have seen a terrible policy of denying the right to victims of presenting Istanbul protocols independently, even though the general law of victims establishes this. In consequence, what has happened is that an independent protocol to be reviewed by the General Attorney's Office of the Republic, which harms the right of presenting an independent protocol, and also what was stated at the Istanbul Protocol. Finally, we are worried that there hasn't been a response from the state regarding the torture situation. We see that there is a speech very focused on the pronouncements that have been pertaining the human rights advocacy, but not the specific cases where they have criminalized torture victims and organizations who accompany torture cases. We believe that in that case it is important that the state also to pronounce themselves regarding a public conviction that the rights of victims of the crime does not overlap the rights of the victim of human rights violations, which is something that has been mentioned in the Mexican context in the last few months, and that has deepened all this environment of discrediting organizations who accompany torture cases and torture victims. on another sense, responding a little bit the question of Commissioner Reguren on implementation, the civil society, who also represents victims in front of the inter-American system, wants to know about the implementation of the protocol of torture investigation on the general law against torture, because we know in Mexico in general makes great efforts to sanction regulations, protocols, but fails in informing on how the implementation works on these measures. And a proof of this is that there is a sub-registry of torture victims, that there's none. And regarding the mechanism that was mentioned by the illustrious state, we want to highlight that the mechanism doesn't consider torture victims and those who denounce the torture, like Gerardo, Roberta, that are here present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to civil society. I now invite the illustrious state of Mexico's representative. 3 minutes.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to point something out. The topic here was the torture victims for human rights organizations. I remember all the statements from the President of the Republic, because we think this is a central issue. In that sense, I want to remember that the distinguished representation of the civil society requested pronouncements in the beginning of their intervention, and the only thing I did was reiterate all the times that from the President of the Republic, my colleagues, yours truly, we have done on international forums, and we have done this in Mexico in front of the society, the media, in a way that I think it is important to point this out. I pass the floor to my colleague. Of course, because we are short in time, I limit myself to 2 things. The first, by request of the representatives of the civil society right now and in this act, I make the pronouncements they are requesting. The rights of the victims do not overlap the rights of the victims on human rights. Attending to that specific request that was made, to point out that in the case of the Executive Commission for Victims' Attention, we are working for not to see it happen again, for a register to be improperly delayed. These registers today are spending approximately 60 days, and we are moving forward to make it less. We will not have again cases of such a significant duration on the register process for victims' attention. And finally, to say that because this is a fundamental topic in any process, there are no faculties of Army representatives to develop any type of civil integrations. The only obligation they have is to expose to the public ministry the person that had been detained in the action. There is no validation that an army could have that will validate this action. Yes, thank you very much. Petitioners, commissioners, Mexican delegation. Very briefly, I think on the topic of the law instrumentation of the law for torture, we could spend a lot of time. So it's important to continue with the civil society, the dialogue, given the specific steps that the Republic has done, and on the framework of the convention and the members of other states. Quickly, I want to refer to 3 questions that were made regarding the strengthening of the prosecution offices. The new law, general law against torture, establishes in Article 35 the obligation of prosecution office by the states to create special prosecution office with technical and operational faculties for the prosecution and defense of the state. This is a work being done for all prosecution officers to have the same work methodology. On the mechanism, the preventive mechanism, the law itself establishes in Article 72 the creation of the National Mechanism for Prevention as an instance to monitor constantly and systematically. So that's the second question that was done. There is a national registry, or it establishes a national registry in torture. This is a very important mechanism to continue statistically the topic. And the training topic, we are training experts and investigators, both with national resources and the support of foreign authorities. Currently, we have 172 doctors and 111 psychologists. With them, the prosecution office specialized on the application of the protocols, all of them trained since 2007, particularly by the National Commission on Human Rights and other international experts. Thank you.
Additional information, but I trust that both sides will send in as much more information as possible, and especially in relation to training of investigators, which is preventive, and we may not need all those doctors if it's prevented. So hopefully, we look forward to your sending us further information. Thank you again very fulsomely for your presentations and informing us of this very serious matter. With that, this hearing is at an end, and the next one must start in 3 minutes. Thank you, everyone. We are now commencing with our final hearing before this panel this morning. Oh, it's now after, no, it's still this morning. And this hearing is the case of Lilia Garcia Andrade and relatives in Mexico, case number 12.853. The hearing was requested by the petitioners to present their arguments before us and to know the position of the Mexican state regarding the criminal investigation of the case. The petitioners will argue in the allotted time of 25 minutes, and the state, the illustrious state of Mexico, will argue in the allotted time of 25 minutes as well. The commission panel will have 10 minutes or so to make any contribution they deem necessary. There will be no responses from either party. I now invite the representatives of the petitioner and the petitioner herself to speak to us and do their arguments. Thank you.
Buenos días.
Good morning, commissioners, delegation of the illustrated state of Mexico. We are here in this hearing Mrs. Nomester Andrade, defender of human rights and mother of Lilia Garcia Andrade, Councilman Peña and Peña Ramirez, in the name of the group of human rights and social justice actions. We will express the facts on case 12.853 that would allow to corroborate the violations on human rights that we develop on our merits text for the case, and that the Mexican state has committed harm in Lilia Andrade and her mother and father, Norma and Esther, and Jose Garcia Pineda, and her son and daughter, Jose Caleb Garcia Andrade and Jadetica Garcia Andrade, present here on this hearing. On this presentation, we will first make the case presentation. Next, we will make a narrative on the 17 years of investigation that have a pattern of failed actions and that have led to perpetrating impunity. We will pronounce ourselves on the only answer by writing that the Mexican state has given towards this case and that proposes a friendly settlement. Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade was a young woman of 17 years old, mother of two, ward on Maquila, surviving on the city of Juarez in 2001. February 14 of that year, when leaving her work, was kidnapped by a group of subjects that held her captive for several days, torturing her sexually. It wasn't until February 21st where her body was found wrapped on a blanket near Maquila, where she worked. Since Lilia Alejandra disappeared, the authorities of the state of Chihuahua neglected to accept the denouncement for the disappearance of the young woman, alleging that they needed 72 hours of disappearance, following the same action that was presented on the case of Alejandro Gonzalez against Mexico, known as Campo Algodonero. When they found Lilia Andrade's murder, she had marks and lacerations in her head, marks in her wrists, cephalic, and other hits in the eyes, injuries on her neck, sign of asphyxiation and laceration on both thighs, and multiple injuries on the anal and vagina area, and signs of being subject to several aggressors. The feminicide happened in a systematic environment of violence against women that has already been identified by the Court on Human Rights on the case Campo Algodonero. But unlike that case, this case, we were able to prove that the same group of men that murdered Lilia Alejandra in 2001 also participated in the kidnapping, sexual torture, and assassination of at least 4 more victims among 1994 and 2005, all of them underage. Of selection, victim profile, similar characteristics on the places of kidnapping and where the bodies of the victim are found, and the same genetic profile of one of the aggressors in some cases. In this way, the case of Lilia Alejandra evidence that the Mexican state has tolerated the operation of a group that kidnaps, tortures sexually, and murders women and girls. Therefore, the responsibility of the Mexican state does not stop on the non-compliance authorities, which has already been credited on the Algodonero case, but by creating false pretenses, full with stereotypes, and they have condemned a group of women killers to continue acting. The act of omission by state agents has shown a non-compliance to the obligation of respect to human rights acknowledged in Article 1.1 of the American Convention. As part of this context as well, we have the threats and aggressions suffered by those who have accompanied the case. This Inter-American Commission granted 10 years ago the precautionary measures number 147-08, lawyers and family members of Lilia Alejandra. These measures were widened in March 2012 after Norma Andrade suffered 2 attempts against her life. The first, December the 2nd of 2011, when leaving her house in Juarez, a person shot her 5 times, facts that were present by Jade and Caleb Garcia. While recovering in a hospital on the surgery that was performed to remove the bullets, we received anonymous calls where a man pointed out that if they continue providing medical assistance to Ms. Norma, doctors and nurses were going to be murdered as well. For that, she was literally kicked out of the hospital, and we were forced to transfer her to the city of Mexico, thinking that she would be safe there. However, February 3rd, she suffered a second attempt. In the door of her new house, a person stabbed her in her neck. She managed to defend herself and survive once more. By that time, who assisted and called the emergency services was the granddaughter, Jade Garcia, by that time 12 years old. From that moment on, both Norma, Jade, and Caleb have permanent protection. They had to permanently leave the city of Juarez. Aside from the forced displacement, they suffered several affections to their mental and physical health. Particularly, the 2 sons of Lilia Alejandra suffered severe psychiatric injuries that have demanded for psychological, and psychiatric health attention that has always been particularly. In the 2 attempts of Norma Andrade, we haven't been able to identify the people responsible, and the investigations have been filed due to lack of context. In this context, for 70 years, the failed investigations of the murder of Lilia Alejandra have taken place. During these 17 years, the authorities have opened and closed lines of investigations without reaching a successful result. In the first 6 years, from 2001 to 2007, the Public Ministry of Chihuahua, starting from anonymous information, identified in different moments 7 probable responsible parties. But the investigation, based on an inconsistent act of 1, having an open line of investigation, 2, acting only by the petition of, or doing actions that may be considered negligent without having a clear objective, taking months or even years on carrying out those actions of investigation, 4, closing those line of investigations, and 5, waiting for the emergence or raising of a new line of investigation. During this period, the greater amount of investigation fall on Norma Andrade and her legal representation. During 2003 and 2004, Mrs. Norma Andrade met personally with the then President of the Republic, the highest authority of the Mexican state, who committed personally to instruct for investigation on the cases, the murder cases, and in particular that the investigation of Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade to be carried out by the Attorney General's Office of the Republic. The Federal Public Ministry was in charge of the investigation of this case during 2003 and 2005 without obtaining any results. Finally, the Federal Public Ministry determined to return the investigation to the Public Ministry of the State of Chihuahua that has continued to act only starting from the request done by the legal representation. My colleague David Peña will continue with this presentation.
Thank you. And once we obtained the Chihuahua authorities to close the investigation that had been started due to an anonymous tip, we went back to point zero of our investigation and to request yet again chemical and biological processing of all evidence encountered in the body of the victim, as well as that localized in the area of the felony. We see in the process of public services and an improvement of the technical infrastructure, all of this within the framework of change of the system for litigation that was followed in the case. And in this area of the investigations, we obtained the authorities of Chihuahua to process in the 2008 the blood that was found in the covers with whom Lilia Alejandra's body was covered. The result of this analysis through a genetic profile correspondent to the male gender. However, we have not been able to encounter the man to match that sample. B, we request for the possible solicitation of comparison between her and the profile of the sperm found in Lydia's body, and we cross-referenced with sperm samples obtained in other feminicide cases. The results obtained by the Prosecutor's Office of the State of Chihuahua, where, and I quote, "There is a genetic correlation where the haplotypes genetically match those of an unknown male whose genetic markup shows in evidence taken from the bodies of the victim Rocio Cordesquivel, Corales Arrieta Mendina, Lidia Alejandra Garcia Andrade, Sonia and Yvette Sanchez Ramirez, Rosa Isela Sánchez Quintanilla, showing in this manner that it is one perpetrator." And I quote, "See, with this information we requested this genetic markup to be inputted in the database for the staff of the government of Chihuahua. In June 5th of 2010, it showed that the investigation had shown as a result, and I quote, that there is a match in the Y chromosome haplotype which corresponds to a blood sample of the card of Enrique Castañeda Aguacas, ministerial agent of the Prosecutor's Office of the State of Chihuahua, who was murdered February 19 of 2010 as he was leaving his house," and I quote. D. Based on this information, the Ministry of Chihuahua requested the organization of other rulings and investigations to determine if sperm samples would correspond to that of the ministerial agent Enrique Castañeda Aguacas, and the result was that the samples do not directly correspond, but to a male of his family. So with this line of investigation in 2011, we created a criminal background investigation to determine places of disappearance and finding of the bodies, different mechanics and elements that could show other patterns and coincidences among the 5 cases, including that of Lidia Alejandra. On April 3rd, 2012, an expert of the Prosecutor's Office of Chihuahua said, and I quote, "Based on the victim analysis of the cases, we see a specific type, being these individuals of the female gender aged between 11 and 17 years of age, of slender complexion, which shows a repetitive pattern for victim selection." This is established as a serial case with a behavioral evidence that has high sexual symbolism. Due to the planning aspects all the way through the dumping of the body, this shows deep planning behavior, so this is an organized offender. And I quote, "Based on this, for the first time, we obtained the Ministry of the State of Chihuahua to clearly identify the existence of a group or individual who has kidnapped and tortured girls as of 1994. Amongst them, Rocio Corderos, age 10 in 94, Rosa Isela Atena, age 14 in 95, Sonia Yvette Sanchez, 13 in 96, Lydia Alejandra Garcia of 17 in 2001, and Cora Larrieta of 17 in 2005. So before the assassination of Lydia Alejandra, they had already assassinated 3 girls. So, as of the result of the paternal lineage in the samples found in the body of Lydia Alejandra and the other 4 victims, the authorities have focused their research only on trying to identify the different members of that family that in the decade of 1995 to 2005 lived in Ciudad Juarez and that had any other participation. It has been 10 years from the date where these were identified, the link of Lydia Alejandra and the other 4 feminicide, and 8 years from the day where we identified the profile of one of the offenders linked to the family of the agent. In all these years, we have not identified, been able to, or wanted to do so by using any other genetic profile as well. So, in this sense, we wanted to see in the case of Lydia Alejandra to identify with the other contacts in terms of the other 4 that have already been linked and potential link to other assassinations that have taken place in the last 20 years. That in agreement with what has been presented by the Inter-American Court in paragraph 378. However, following up with this pattern that we have already referred to, the authority has decided to, number 1, have an open line for investigation, 2, to do the follow-up, 3, to undergo errands that might feel that are tedious, also for taking years to complete these. The Prosecutor's Office of the State of Chihuahua, following up with a request that has been done in terms of linking the case of Lydia Alejandra with other additional cases to those that already have been related, in 2017 only did 2 substantial due diligences to continue to push forward this investigation. Number 1, to request the Department of Justice of the United States information about one of the members of the Castañeda Ogas family, requirement that was dismissed by the American authorities because it did not meet the minimum legal requirements. And number 2, the creation of a psychological, criminological sentence which stated that this is a male who is familiar with the area where the victim was harassed and taken, who probably knew her and knew that this was an emotionally vulnerable individual, which allowed him to create an important emotional connection which was expressed or manifested during the time that she was captive. Looking at the way where she was then kept captive and the way that the body was dumped. This is someone who will repeat the same behavioral pattern and with the same type of victim most likely, and I quote, "This with the prejudice in the type of gender with the authorities continue to work on. These are present not only in the judicial reasoning, in the interventions of the police and the public ministry, as it has been credited in the Inter-American Court in the field paragraph 401, but that these prejudices are also present in the criminal area, where for someone to maintain an underage individual, to submit her to days of sexual tortures, to then dump her body, is interpreted as an affectionate connection between the offender and the offendee. This is presented in the fact that these individuals are finding conclusions that were already in the file for 10 years now, and the case of Lydia Alejandra is directly related to that of other 4 victims, acknowledging the fact that this man or group of men can continue to murder. So 17 years of the day of the murdering of Lydia Alejandra, they have continued to follow a pattern of stagnation that has allowed impunity to go on without having an open petition line, doing diligences that can be tedious and long, taking too long to perform them, and then close the line under any pretext, and to expect for the completion of a new line of research. And we are at risk today of this pattern continuing to repeat, because the Mexican government doesn't seem to be trying to find the reality of the facts and justice, but to allow men to continue to assassinate and torture females and children, and they are only waiting for time to go by for the case to go cold, and then say that they are not legally capable of continuing the investigation. I am sure that the representatives of the Mexican state will say that these were errors, negligences of the past, and that things will now be changed, corrected, or that the errors of yesterday have had consequences in this as well as many other things, but that they have the entire intention to move forward and stop and change. But for us, it is impossible to give them any credibility, because it's been 17 years, regardless of the political party ruling the state of Chihuahua, regardless of the public policies, of the legislative breakthroughs, and the modernization of forensic services. The case of Lydia Alejandra continues to be an example of a research where negligence is constant. This is why we think it's not possible to reach a friendly solution, and I give the floor to Norma Esther Sandrade. I would like to begin my participation by quoting a fragment of a letter that I wrote to my daughter on the 17th year of her murdering. Dear daughter, today is a very important day for us. It is 17 years since the day you were ripped away from my life. Your same age, and I'm still demanding for justice. They have refused me the right of holding you, of bidding you farewell. I was denied the privilege of closing your eyes, and when after 7 days you came back to me, you came back in a coffin. And there, in front of your urn, I promised that I was not going to rest until justice was made. And I was so naive to believe in the government, to believe that they were going to do their job, to find the ones who put you there and give us the explanations that my dad, your dad, and myself wanted to know. Your dad died without hearing those answers. Your file has gone through so many hands of incompetent government officers, 9 prosecutors, 7 public ministries, 4 governors, 3 presidents of the country, and they have all promised the same, that your case would not go unsolved. It's been 17 years, and all of them, every single one, has lied. This is the letter that I wrote to my daughter. We received a proposal of the Mexican state, and very sadly, I read what I knew that they would say all along, and that Surely they will repeat today that they're so sorry for my pain, that they acknowledge the mistakes that were made on the case, that investigations are still underway, and that my grandchildren can have scholarships, that we can have psychological attention for my family and other social programs that I can access, even if I had not had a daughter be murdered. However, in this friendly solution that they're offering, there is one key element that is not included. And it is specifically, how are we going to ensure justice for my daughter and grandchildren if during the 17 years we've done the same thing? Lie to me. Today, I'm sorry, but I don't believe in you. Because it seems that you have not realized that you didn't kill a pet. My daughter was murdered. A daughter who had dreams and illusions. The mother of a 1-year-old with 8 months. And the mother of a 5-year-old. Today, grown-ups who are here with me. I didn't think that it would be necessary to take 17 years to face the Mexican government and to say to them that because of my justice demand, my grandchildren and myself live as foreigners in my own country. We're not free to walk out on the streets because we're terrified of being harmed, and that we can't even go back to Ciudad Juarez, where my family, with my friends are, where I buried my daughter, where I buried my husband and my mother. It breaks my heart, and I have cried of anger, of helplessness every time that I hear the officers of the Mexican state throughout all these years to tell me that, yes, now we will do it right. It's just a matter of more time, and that the ones that are responsible for this will be caught. How can this be true? If it's been 17 years of listening to the same lies every time after I was almost murdered, people told me to just give it up, to let my daughter rest. But my daughter didn't just die. Death is natural. My daughter was killed, and that is a big difference. And the only way that our hearts can find peace is for justice to be made. When I heard that the same group of men who murdered Alejandra had also killed other children, and when I saw their files, I saw that their cases are forgotten, I decided that, you know what, despite the risk, I cannot give up. I firmly believe that the only way that I can find justice for my daughter and for all those girls and murdered women is with the intervention of the Inter-American Commission that can help the government, that can push the government to stop the feminicides, that as the Mexican government has acknowledged itself, they continue to kidnap and murder other children and women. I am here because just like my daughter, there are so many other murdered women who have left orphaned children, just as Hade, who is here, that simply don't exist for the state. That despite the femicides, they are throughout the country. There are so many orphaned children. There is no comprehensive policy to help them. Today, 17 years later, I do not trust the Mexican authorities, but I trust you. Commissioner, I hope you can help us get closer to our justice that we crave so much.
Much civil society, and thank you very much, the Madre of Lilia. I now invite the illustrious state of Mexico to make their arguments.
Señoras comisionadas, señor secretario ejecutivo.
Commissioners, dear representation of the civil society executives. To begin, the Mexico state, our delegation, recognizes the presence in this hearing of teacher Norma Andrade, mother of Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade, Teacher Norma Andrade, this delegation extends respectful greetings, recognizing the fight you have done for so long due to the death of your daughter. I allow myself to express in the name of on behalf of the Mexican state that we understand and we respect your suffering that you have gone through since these events took place. In the same way, I reiterate on this public hearing the commitment of the Mexican state to attend your case, Lillian's case, respecting in every moment your rights, your will, and your demands. The hearing that the Mexican state has been called upon bears around the life of Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade, who was presented by her disappearance February 14th of 2001, and with this, the investigation actions carried out by Mexican authorities aiming to determine the criminal responsibilities of the corresponding act. Initially, the state acknowledges that the previous events are surrounded by a fact of violence against women on the city of Juarez and Chihuahua that prevailed by that time on the sentence on 2009 dictated in the Gonzalez case by the Inter-American Court and others against Mexico, better known as Campo Algodonero. The Inter-American Court determined that since 1993 existed in Juarez City an increase on women murders, but more than the figures expressed their concerns because some of these crimes showed extreme signs of violence, mainly sexual violence, that have been influenced by a culture of discrimination against women, which has affected the motives and the modality of the crimes and the response against them. The sentence had a positive impact internally, both in the state and federal levels, and have allowed to strengthen the tools that the state has in terms of human rights to face the issue of violence against women. Within the highlighted measures are the standardization of the protocols, the ministry investigation measures, justice provide and delivery methods to see and stop the different types of violence against women, to the implementation of a program for search and rescue of women disappeared in Chihuahua. 3, the strengthening of Protocol ALBA, for the creation of the National Registry of Missing People and Non-Located and forensic data. 5, the recent adoption of the general law in terms of forced disappearance of people committed by individuals and the National People Search System. Now relating this procedure, followed by this commission, March the 14th, the Mexican state expressed its will to solve the following case. In the same report, the state mentioned the preliminary measures that would be taken to accomplish a comprehensive redress of the victims. Particularly, I want to underline ensuring the full access to truth and justice. Of course, the beginning of a solutions process in this case is subject to the posture of the victims. Regarding the Mexican state will be very respectful, and in the same way, the content of the redress measures will depend on the capture dialogue that may be able to begin between the Mexican authorities and the victims. In this way, the state reinstates its intention of starting that dialogue, aiming to find a comprehensive solution to the case. For the effects of this hearing, the state will leave clear, firstly, its acknowledgement of its international responsibility due to the facts of this case, and base the redress measures that are proposed to be taken based on the inter-American values. To approach these aspects, I pass the floor to the Deputy Secretary of the Human Rights, Rafael Levante. Thank you. Good morning, teacher Norma Esther Andrade. These are the cases where there are no words. It's very difficult. You've heard things over and over again. You anticipated you're going to hear them again. But here we expect that very soon, in the facts, not the words, are difference. Because it's a very painful waiting time. I salute Jade and Jose Caleb, who the day of this tragic event had 1 year and 9 months of age. And today, almost to 18, they are still pending this response. It is painful and a shame for the state of Mexico. We acknowledge, because of this, our international responsibility due to the non-compliance on the duty of prevention around this disappearance, life-taking event on Lilia. Due to the context to that, the city of Juarez, the state recognizes its responsibility for the insensitivity that has been present on the investigations and the deficiencies that in time supported structures that were equipped with investigation capabilities on gender-based murders, not only in this case, but all the cases involved with this so painful event. Ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, based on this acknowledgement, the Mexican state reiterates its will. We have listened the understandable position of the petitioners, but we reiterate our will of starting a process of friendly settlement with accompaniment of this honorable commission to find measures destined to reach in a way that's possible and comprehensive repair of the harms and damages and losses. The measures we have identified and that we could share with this commission, I would like to mention, reiterating this is a proposal and consequently would need to be adjusted with a close dialogue of the victims and in hand of the results that we can share. The Governance Secretariat counts with a trust fund for the compliance on human rights aspects that grant judicial certainty for the victims, and it is ruled by legislation which are part of the court. In that way, this rule includes the calculation of damages for non-material losses, including direct and indirect victims. The material damage that is part of the entire package in due time will submit to the consideration of the victims, and damage to the life project, taking into consideration that Lilia Alejandra today would be 17 years from the time she disappeared. The Mexican state also adds a road of health in charge of the Secretariat in charge of health, both from the federal side and from the state, that guarantees health certainty for all the victims of this case with a specificity that may be required in this case. The state also wants to find a productive project that could benefit victims, like scholarships according to the desires and the needs of the victim. In front of these painful facts, the state proposes the celebration of a public act which features and resolutions could be agreed with the victims. We also need to remember that the compliance of the sentence Campo Algodonero have allowed the Mexican state to comply with public policies that look for the eradication of feminicide. We have new investigation protocols that contemplate the gender perspective, new laws and institutions that attend to violence and discrimination against women, and also laws and institutions for concrete actions and the fight against the forceful disappearance or disappearance acts of people and their perpetrators. Most of these regulations are recent, and we are looking to enforce the implementation. The state is in its best will to identify, with your help, new areas of opportunity where we can establish additional measures, everything that we need to do to prevent for terrible cases like the one of Lily Alejandra to continue happening in our country. But the most important thing is that the Mexican state here in front of you and the commissioners commit to continue with the investigations of this case, this time very diligently in hand with the victims and ensuring you the access to the truth and justice. The state understands that this justice component is without a doubt the right and justice pretension that you have and the big debt that we have with you. And as such, we commit to prioritize above everything the doing of these actions. I want to pass the floor to Sergio Castro Guevara. Not before highlighting that with the independency of the redress measures, the state is in full disposition to agree any additional measure with the representatives of the victims and the victims themselves they consider important to include, if given the case you agreed to a friendly settlement. I give the floor to Sergio Castro. Commissioners, Teacher Norma Andrade. During my intervention, I will refer to the investigations about the facts of this case, which are in charge of the Prosecution Office of the State of Chihuahua, and I would like to highlight that the responsibility of that investigation falls on yours truly, the Attorney General Cesar Augusto Peniche Espejel. Preliminary, I highlight that the previous investigation was started February 21st of 2001 when we received the request in presence of the public ministry in the city of Juarez, where we found a person, a female person, dead. With this, the prosecutor's office started the investigation through which we pushed different actions to locate the responsibles of the feminicide of Lily Alejandra Garcia Andrade. Starting from the claim, we started actions that ended on different investigation lines to identify the responsibles, to investigate employees and administrative staff of a close environment where the child was found. 2, to investigate the surroundings of the victim and all its aspects. 3, different lines of investigations in lieu of the rewards offered and the anonymous calls. A line of investigation, the possible responsibility of a public official. As pointed out recently, the state recognizes the existence of flaws on the initial stages of the investigation of this case. However, we highlight that starting in 2004, the investigation of female murders was specialized, and we pushed the training of staff to prevent this type of crime. Starting in 2005, the application of new technological advances widened the lines of investigation for this case, looking always to attend to the concerns and suggestions of teacher Norma Andrade and her representatives. Currently, commissioners, the Attorney General's office in the state of Chihuahua has done efforts in effect for this to take place diligently. Particularly, I allow myself to highlight that the prosecutor's office has taken into consideration the pattern of human rights violation existent in the city of Juarez to highlight the following. First, the criteria derived from the sentence of the Campo Bonero case have been considered in the investigations of this case, which has helped to define a clear context of the violence against women by that time period. In this sense, we have contemplated the complex phenomenon pertaining female murders in the city of Juarez and Chihuahua, which cannot be analyzed in an isolated way because the investigations have necessarily been accompanied by a comprehensive analysis on the social and structural reasons that have caused it. Under this line of thought, we considered the recommendations, the general recommendations of several experts that Mexico invited to know firsthand the problem that is being present in the city of Juarez. Among them, the Special Rapporteurship on the Independence of Judges by the UN, the Rapporteur for the Rights of Women on the Commission on Human Rights, the experts of the Office on the UN Offices for Drugs and Crimes, experts of the Committee for the Convention for the Eradication of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, by its initials in English, and the Special Rapporteurship for Violence Against Women of the United Nations. In the same matter, the investigations have complemented other murder cases of women in the city of Juarez that happened from 1993 to this date. Particularly, the investigations of this case have implied an analysis from the technical and judicial point of view of the files on the previous investigations on women murders by gender in the city of Juarez, aiming to determine the possible lines of investigations and actions tending to clarify the facts. Finally, around the possible deficiencies and irregularities on behalf of government officials that were directly involved on the integration of investigations for the feminicides. And by the time of the murder of Lily Garcia Andrades and the case of Campo Algunero, we have fired government officials and started movements that some of them have ended on convictions and arrests and detentions for government officials. By the time the present study of context was done, we strengthened structurally different lines of investigation, and we have implemented other plans with aims to strengthen the investigation on cases of feminicides in the city of Juarez. One, the strengthening of expert services in the different areas that are part of it, highlighting the area of forensic genetics, labs that count with international standards, and the constant training of its operators. Two, the training of officials of the prosecution's office in gender perspective problems, and in particular, the specialized prosecution's office who deals with murder cases for women with gender-based perspective, the strengthening of the families by psychological health and legal counseling for the victims and families of the victims to repair the damage. Ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, Teacher Norma Andrade, taking into account the previous information, we highlight that for the effects of this present hearing, the Mexican state is limited to provide greater details of the investigation that could compromise the integrity of the investigations. And for this reason, we request very respectfully to you, commissioners, and mainly to the teacher, to sustain a private work meeting after this hearing. Additionally, so we can share with this Honorable Commission and with the victims the current state of the investigation. I consider such space would allow to update Teacher Norma Andrade and her grandchild and representatives the most recent actions of these investigations, and if it's deemed applicable, to locate the justice element in the context of a possible friendly settlement. However, I allow myself to ensure that we are currently ensuring the file with a renewed view and taking into consideration the context of the homicides of the city of Juarez in the previous decades. Lastly, I would like to highlight that we will continue ensuring the victims and its representatives to come with full access to the files so they can continue participating in them, and if they wish to have the knowledge of the work being done by the prosecution office currently, highlighting that the obligation of investigating the facts and sanctioning the responsible parties falls in the Mexican state, and right now in yours truly. Thank you very much.
Can I just I would invite the country rapporteur and continue my habit of speaking last. The country rapporteur first to make her interventions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my condition as rapporteur for Mexico and rapporteur of the children's rights, I have to say, with all honesty, it's very hard for me to to express myself right now, but I want to tell Norma and her children that I share your pain, my deep commitment. So, like you said, Norma, have the expectation that we in the Commission can contribute to the search for justice and truth and non-repetition. I would like to, because Norma has said her position, has stated her position to us, state made a very specific statement on its interest, or not its interest, its position on acknowledging an international responsibility for the Mexican state. And this proposal that I would allow myself, with my colleagues' permission, to talk about an anticipated solution, because the friendly, it's hard for me to assimilate. And I say with the respect of my colleagues because of what our mechanism represents, which that's how we name it. And according to the explanation done by the prosecutor of the state of Chihuahua, I just like to call the attention that when you mentioned the public defenders, one of them, Enrique Castañeda, and family, correct? Because that's a character that has, and I'm assuming that that will state on the investigations that you are pointing out, these are at a stage where we cannot make any precise arguments on how the investigations are going in that line. My question specifically is what Norma has said. Attempts she has suffered, threats she continues to suffer. Is there an investigation? Why is she being threatened by her condition of mother of Lilia, of defender of human rights? What is being done with this investigation that today puts in jeopardy the life of Norma directly? Because this is what she stated. So I would like to have information about that aspect, and in this new vision of the expertise, if you are considering and if they are being investigated as well, the deaths of these girls of 11, 14, 17 years old, the other 4 victims, if there is also an investigation, that even though it is not directly connected with the investigation of Lilia, it is important to know if there are investigations about it and a commitment of not allowing a prescription of these facts to take place. That's what particularly I would like to express.
Commissioner Flavia to make her interventions.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. From my side, I add to the position of my dear Commissioner Esmeralda to express the greatest amount of solidarity, our active listening, of our respect and admiration for your fighting capacity, looking for justice, rights, dignity, respect. We, from part of the Commission, all the commitment, all the efforts to precisely contribute with this fight. precisely taking into consideration the inter-American standards, the duties of the Mexican state. And I would like to ask two questions to the Mexican state. The first, pertaining the specific case of Lilia Garcia Andrade. The disappearance happened February 21st of 2001, correct? But it's left 7 days until the body, until her death. With, by that time, the protocol was of waiting 72 hours. I would like to know now why, because there was a highlight of a new protocol, investigation protocol, in cases of gender violence. What is the methodology today based on gender perspective for the state to exercise its duty to investigate violations? And also, on the area of the state's responsibility, there was here the presentation for a proposal on behalf of the state of acknowledging the responsibility for material damages and losses, education, scholarships, public act of acknowledgement, specific protocols, right, to be developed. Even more, these protocols to react and prevent and punish the violence against women in the investigation, but taking into account exactly the petition. Would there be a comprehensive scope? What would be the scope of the responsibility of the state relating not only to the investigation but also to the integrity and life? That would be my second question. Thank you, and hopefully we will accomplish justice and implement here measures to guarantee the rights.
Have much time. I'm going to try and be very short. As the rapporteur of women's rights, and also as I was a member of the Cottonfield panel of judges who pronounced that decision and set standards and for what the state of Mexico ought to do in relation to this type of egregious violence against women, and also some subsequent cases that followed those. That particular case, I'm not going to repeat what my sister commissioners have said. They're clear. I adopt what they have asked for as well. And I just want to see how Mother Norma can, and the son of Lilia can, and family and children, can receive closure in this matter, in having truth, the true circumstance, and justice, a feeling of justice. Because listening to the facts was very painful, I know, for us. So I can imagine, but I cannot feel the same level of the pain and suffering that they felt and still feel. But one understands their feeling of upset, their feeling of frustration, of anger, and feeling of powerlessness over the length of time this has taken. And I admit that I feel slightly a feeling of powerlessness ourselves, because this situation in that area has gone on for so long. So because of that, I am going to say that I am happy that you have mentioned a working meeting here, immediately that can be arranged. But we, the commissioners, cannot participate in that because of the stage that the matter is in before us. But our legal specialist, Sylvia, can be present and accompany the petitioner and the representatives of that meeting. And I will urge you to take part, if you can, bring yourself to do so and try to do so at that meeting so that you can learn the details of what cannot be disclosed in public by the state to what is happening with the investigations of your daughter's case and in that region. Sylvia could be with you, okay? And then we will know, we will continue, and I do acknowledge the state's candidness in acknowledging international responsibility and in preferring to go ahead with a friendly settlement, which they are not sure about. But please don't close the door. But we, the Commission, will say, even if you agree that you will go to this working meeting and you will not close the door on a possible friendly settlement, we will still continue with the case to merits stage and beyond in case negotiations fall apart. Right? Because there's that possibility, and we don't want any further delay. There's been too much delay. I urge the state. We don't know what the investigation is like, but Sylvia will be there to find out. I urge the state that the only way this matter can be resolved, so no other woman is, and when I say woman, I mean children becoming women, are put in that situation because Lilia suffered torture. The court has decided that one act of rape is and can amount to torture. And she was there for several days undergoing sexual abuse. That is serious torture for a young child. She is a child. And no other child should go through this. You have a serious pedophilic problem in that area. Men who like young children. So you have to sort it out. That's the only thing that can, clear the slate, and also to investigate the officers who failed to do their duty, because they also have a problem which has to be sorted out, as the court acknowledged when we did the Cottonfield case. So with that, I do ask that we can try to make space available, Mr. Executive Secretary, so that you have this working meeting and learn what is happening with the investigations. Then thereafter, reconsider your position as to friendly settlement. You might find that because of what you learn, your attitude to that has changed. I know that I'd said no time for response, but I will give 2 minutes and 2 minutes to this, because this is very important and it's such an emotion-filled matter. So 2 minutes.
Gracias, comisionada presidenta. Vamos a asistir a la reunión porque...
Very well. We're going to thank the meeting because, of course, we will be asking for responses. We are going into this meeting with skepticism, of course, because we have received throughout all these years many empty promises. And right now, this doesn't mean more than yet another promise that we do hope at some point can be fulfilled. We do have, of course, a concern with the public ministry. I did not know this gentleman, so hello. And we are concerned that your appointment is a result of the pressure that we have inflicted on the Mexican state, and this new information is created now as part of this pattern that, as we've mentioned, has been presented for 17 years to maintain open a line of investigation, to pretend that something is being done, to take years to do that, finally close it, and then once again to wait for the existence of new information, to then continue on with this seamless, never-ending cycle of impunity. And this is important We promoted this sentence ourselves, but 8 years after this, nothing has changed in the Mexican state. The case of Lydia Alejandro is not about public policy. It is not about the lack of protocols. It is not about legislative reform. That's not the issue. The issue is that we have not done the investigation with the due diligence, that nothing has been done in terms of moving forward in the murder of Lydia Alejandra. What's important is that the group of criminals that kidnapped her, that tortured her sexually and murdered her continues to operate in Ciudad Juarez, just as you have acknowledged. It concerns us as well that before this case was admitted, the Mexican state had only sent 2 reports to the Inter-American Commission, and in these very vague reports, they had pointed out that some public policies were being done to be able to prevent, sanction, and eradicate violence against women, just as we heard today. But these public policies, before the case was admitted, had no impact on justice. Once the case was admitted by the Inter-American Commission, once the admissibility report was sent out and published, the Mexican state has not sent his report in writing. And as a matter of fact, this is the first occasion where we hear the position of the Mexican state. So the Mexican state has not responded to our arguments, has not responded to the violations that we have said have been committed, and has not even presented any type of substantial evidence that will substantiate everything that has not been given to us in the last 17 years. So that is why we ask for you to respectfully hear that the Mexican state needs to prove that they're actually doing something. And just to respond to Ms. Esmeralda, the commissioner, regarding the attempts on my life, the public ministry said to me on my face, "Are you aware that this is like seeking for a needle in a haystack?" After looking at the camera showing that the aggressor was not visible, it would only show me as I was going by, and then the ambulance coming to pick me up. So that is the file. Because they said, well, we can't find them, so we're sending this record to the dead and cold cases. And that's it. That's where it was left, as if nothing happened.
The state, I ask you for your repair, but bear that in mind when you engage in the working meeting, so that she can have some answers. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chairwoman. And there are 4 things that I believe we need to respond to. Number 1, the meeting with the Human Rights Commissioner, the meeting with the mother of Lydia Alejandra Andrade. We propose that the commissioner is present, with the presence of the commission. That is the intention, that you are there, not without you. So that is one thing that I would like to clarify. Number 2, the Mexican state has accepted the international responsibility. At one point, one of my colleagues will specify in which term. And 3rd, in March of 2018, we did respond to the commission. We're not twisting the arguments. We were not refuting those, because we accepted the international responsibility of the state, but we did provide a response. And in the topic of protection, I will give the floor to my colleague. Thank you. And regarding the topic of security and safety for the teacher, yes, we are offering protection on behalf of the instances and the tools that we have from the Secretariat of the Governance as a mechanism for human rights protection, and in the Executive Commission for the follow-up of investigations and the harms that you have been subject to. That is the intention, so that we can ensure that, as is possible, no further damages are incurred on you.
Gracias. Buenas tardes, doña Norma, Carla Michelle.
Thank you. And this is just to respond to the question of Ms. Piovesan in terms of responsibility. What the state offers us to accept responsibility for the right to life, personal integrity, personal freedom, equality of the child facing the law, all of them acknowledged by the Inter-American Commission, from the obligation of the state of ensuring these rights as a result of Article 1.1 of the Convention, which I also understand that's something that the petitioners mentioned. And in this sense, we only want to add that the state would also use this as the foundation for the case in terms of the admissibility report.
Say, in relation to the working meeting, I have been further advised, and we have been further advised by Sylvia Serrano, our legal officer, that we commissioners can participate in the working meeting, but it will be an informal working meeting, because we cannot formally meet with you, and certainly it would not be that it is a friendly settlement meeting, but for the information which you mentioned, we will have, because it is left with the petitioner and her representatives that whether they want to proceed to a friendly settlement negotiation with the state, which they will decide thereafter. But we would try to see whether we can arrange this informal working meeting for the state to give information which it cannot give publicly on the basis that it's confidentially received in the course of this week. Yes? Yes? See? Okay. On that basis, then, we'll call this hearing to an end and thank all parties for their participation, and including the members of the public. Until tomorrow morning, I bid you good day. Thank you.